This is part 2 of our watercolor pencils for beginner series. So in part 1, I went over all of the supplies that I suggest and use. And today we're just going to get right into different techniques that we can use with the watercolor pencils and how I like to use them. So if you're interested in that, then stay tuned. Now I am using the Arches hot pressed paper for this. Arches hot press is one of my favorite papers. So I will be getting a little bit more of a smooth look to my watercolor pencils today. Now, if you want to keep more of a watercolor textured look, then you could definitely pick a cold press paper, and I explained that in the previous video. But just for the purposes of today, because I have lots of this paper available, that's what I'm going to use. Now, I'm just going to show you the difference between blending with a regular brush and a water brush. So this is my Princeton Neptune 8 round brush, and this is my water brush. So this is a pre-filled water brush. And so I'm just going to take 2 different colors here. So I've got a light lemon yellow color and a light ultramarine color. And I'm just going to scribble these down on the paper. Now you're going to notice I'm not being super careful with these. I'm just getting the pencil down on the paper. And that's because these Albrecht Durer pencils blend out so nicely. They blend out so smoothly. So I'm going to leave a little bit of gap because we'll come back afterwards and I'll show you how you can glaze colors over top of these. But again, I'm just going to get this down. Now I'm trying to be smooth, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be perfect. If I was using colored pencils, I'd want to be going in these nice little circles and making sure that everything's even. With watercolor pencils, we can be a little bit more messy, therefore we can be a little bit faster. So probably for the first color, I'll show you with my water brush just because it is lighter and it's not going to show up as much. So when I am using my water brush, I like to have a paper towel nearby, and this is where I start activating my paper towel. Because as you guys, I don't know if you can see, but the water will sort of bubble up and then it will drop down. So depending on what your artwork is here, you don't want that first drop of water to drop onto your art and ruin it or cause a bloom or something like that. So I always like to first activate it on the paper towel, but then once it's activated, I hardly ever have to go back and activate it again, and I just take it and I take sweeping motions from one side to the other. And this is when I want a nice smooth flat area. And I can even come back over one more time. And this is also really helping me with my water control because this is going to dry very quickly because I'm not using a lot of water. So we can come back over top of this much quicker. Then I just take the brush and wipe it onto the paper towel, and that's good enough to clean it. Now when I'm going in with a regular brush, I will use a jar of water like this, and I tend to choose more of like some kind of towel that will soak up more water, just because I find the paper towel gets wet a lot quicker, and this will kind of soak up much more water. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pretty wet, and then I'm just going to dab it off onto the paper towel so that it's wet, but it's not soaking or dripping wet. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to come back and forth. And of course you can go as slow or as fast as you want. And I'm just blending this out. And then if I feel like I want it just a little bit more blended, I'll do the exact same thing. And I can just come back over and blend that out. Then just rinsing that brush off and just dabbing it off on here. Then I can set that off to the side. So you can see you get a very similar result. This way, I feel like because I'm using a little bit less water, I get a brighter color, whereas this one, it kind of toned down the color a little bit, but we can go back in and add more color. So this one's pretty much almost dry, but we'll come back and do another layer there, and then I'll come back again and show you how to glaze over top of these. Now, another fun way to use these watercolor pencils, especially if you're more used to watercolor, is to use a palette like this. So I talked about this in the previous video, but I'm going to show you how to use it now. And if you don't have a palette like this, I'm going to show you how to use it on a piece of masking tape. So this is just masking tape, but all I'm going to do is, because this palette is textured, I'm just going to take this pencil. Actually, maybe I'll use a darker color so that it will show up more. I'm going to use this cobalt turquoise. So I'm just going to take this and scribble onto the palette here. And this is leaving some of the watercolored pencil behind. Now, I would only do this with water-based mediums. I wouldn't do this with my colored pencil because it's not going to come up. But if you don't have this, you can just have a piece of tape. So let's say you border your artwork with some masking tape. You can do the exact same thing here. And we're just going to lay this down. And then I'm just going to come in, get some water here. And depending how watery you want this to be, I don't have to dab this off. I can just go right in and pick this up just like watercolor. And then I can just start putting it down on the paper like this. I can kind of go in and then just start playing with it. If I want it to be a little bit lighter on this end, and then just start, you know, doing exactly what I would with watercolor. So if you look at my Watercolor for Beginners series, all of the techniques that you can use for that would also apply to the watercolor pencils, especially if you're using this technique. And I'm going to show you how to do this with my water brush as well. So again, if you want to be a little bit more controlled, we can just pick up just a little bit of this pigment and put it down. Like, let's say there's just one little area where I want, you know, some fine lines or something, I can do that. Or I can, again, activate it, get a little bit more water going there, and scoop this up just like watercolor. And then I can kind of do the exact same thing. Now, the only thing with this, it will stain the brush. So I tend to just have a jar of water off to the side where I can then rinse my brush off really well. Because I find it can stain it over time, and it's harder to get rinsed off, especially if you're just wiping it off like this. So I do find just putting it into a jar of water, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a water brush. So if I am using this technique, I generally choose a regular water brush over this one. So it just depends how you like to work. And I'm just going to show you quickly here how I can just go right over top of this area now that it's dry. And I'm just going to put a second layer down, and how we can still build up our color. Now, because this is a second layer, it's going a little bit more smoothly because some of the tooth is covered. And I'm just going to grab this. Again, I'm going to dab it off on that cloth that I have. And then I'm just going to come right over top and blend this out again. And you can see how this color just becomes a little more saturated now and a little darker. There. Now, another cool thing, if you were using this palette or the masking tape technique, is we can also mix our colors on here. So let's say if I put a little bit of the yellow down, and I can do it on both. Then I'm going to choose a little bit of a warmer red because I want to get some orange. So if you're not sure about color theory or what colors you should be using, then go ahead and check out my Watercolor for Beginners Watercolor Theory series. And I will try to have that stuff linked down below. But I'm going to use just a little bit less of the red here. And we can mix these two colors together. So again, I'm going to grab that wet brush, and now we get sort of like this peachy orangey color. And that's kind of cool. So I'll rinse that off, dab that off. Maybe I don't want this one as wet. And we'll put that on there too. So you can kind of mix your colors together and get different tones. And while these top two colors are dry now, I'm just going to show you how we can take another color and glaze right over them. So I'm going to take this warmer red color and just kind of do the bottom half here. And again, I'm being very messy, just glazing this color over. Now you could go ahead and do this on the palette first and then glaze it over, but I'm going to do it right on the paper and just show you what happens. And then I'm going to take this cooler red color and I'm going to go over our blue part here. Just like that. And then maybe I'll go ahead and take my water brush and I'm going to blend this out. And you can see how we're just tinting this color now. So it's just slightly changing it. And then as it gets away from the yellow, it's becoming a little more true. And if I want to go ahead and soften that, I can just go back over with this brush and just lightly soften that edge. And just really get rid of any harsh edges just by dabbing it on my brush. And one cool thing, as you're probably noticing, is this yellow color underneath isn't moving or lifting. Once it's down and blended and dry, it becomes fairly permanent, which is perfect for times like this when we just want to glaze a color over top. And let's say I just want to softly let this blend out. So maybe I'll start on the top side here, and I'm just going to blend this color down. And just add a little bit of color to it. And I can just keep going over that edge because it's not going to disturb the layer below it. Now, if I scrub a lot, and especially with those more stiff brushes, then you're going to be more apt to disturb the layer here. So let's say you want it to come in and add a little highlight or something, you could use a scrubber brush like this. And I would just dip it into the water and then dab it off on my paper towel. And I could come over top and scrub the pigment off that way. But again, you've got to be very careful that you're not going to scrub the paper off underneath. Now, Arches paper, whether it's hot press or cold press, it's a pretty hardy paper, so it can take a bit of scrubbing without the paper starting to peel up. But if you're not using 100% cotton paper, or if you're using a more student grade paper, you want to be pretty careful with that. But just look at the difference between that versus just trying to scrub it off. Like, it's coming up a little bit, but definitely not as much as that. So you can kind of use different techniques to your advantage like that. If you've, spread the color past an area where you need a highlight, you can always go in with your scrubber brush and fix it that way. Now, I've got some masking fluid all over here that's already dry. Normally I use this more with my watercolors, but I just want to show you that you still can use it with your watercolor pencils. Now, you just want to be careful because this is a little bit tacky. So if you start pushing up against it with your watercolor pencil, you can sort of lift it or move it, or it can kind of stick to your watercolor pencil. But if you're just very gentle, you can get around the edges of it. But you're going to notice, like, when you hit it, it does kind of stick. So just be aware of that. Now, this is the Winsor & Newton yellow tinted masking fluid. And I find I've had no issues with this, whether I'm using it with watercolor or my watercolor pencils. So I'm just going to get a little bit of color in here, and just look how messy I'm being. I really don't need to be, if I want this to be a little bit lighter, I can just put a little bit around there. Super messy. And I'm going to take my water brush here. Again, I'm going to go ahead and activate it onto my paper towel. And then I'm just going to take this and just start blending all of this out. And even though I was super messy, it still blends very evenly. So evenly. I am so impressed with these watercolor pencils. It really does get rid of all of those little marks. And then I can just come over top of this. And you could use a regular brush for this as well, and it won't disturb the pencil. we'll go ahead and let that dry. Now, another cool technique you can use is where you actually go ahead and wet the paper before. So let's say I want to just wet this area here. So I'm just going to get a little bit of water. And I'm just going to have enough water on the paper. I don't want any puddles, but I want it wet enough so that this technique is going to work. And then I can take that pencil and just come over top and do some marks. And depending how wet it is, so let's say over here I had a little bit more water. So if I have more water here, it's going to blend out just a little bit more. So you can see how those lines are kind of softening now. And you can kind of do some little dots and stuff. And it's kind of cool. And depending how much water, it's going to spread out a little bit more. If you use a little bit less water, it will spread out a little bit less. Also, if you wanted like a little fine line, what you could do, and I would use a smaller brush for this, but this is what I have. You can take just a little bit of water just to the tip of the pencil. Now, I would try not to get on the wood part, but I'm going to go just on the pencil itself, and then I can come in and do some lines. Let's say I need some little fine details. Now, this brush doesn't have the best point to it, but you get the idea that you can kind of come in and get some little details and stuff like that just by taking from the edge of it. Now, you want to be careful once it is wet, because if you start coming back onto the paper, it can break the tip, but you can come in very lightly, and then you can still go back and blend that out. And you can see, because it was wet a little bit though, it is leaving tiny, harsher details. So, you know, you can kind of use that to your advantage, because again, once it gets wet and blended onto the paper, it's going to become a little bit more permanent. So it is going to be a little harder to then blend out. So if you want some texture in the background or something like that, you can use that to your advantage too. And one of the last ways I like to use just the watercolor pencils themselves is, again, if I want a little bit more detailed, you can come in with these like you would colored pencils. So let's say I need some detail lines in here. I can just come over top and get some detail lines, or maybe I need some fur, even though this is blue fur, you never know. Like, so you can come over top, and because we did a base layer, it's sort of like when you put your colored pencils down, blend them out, and you sort of get rid of the tooth of the paper, then you can come over top and like get any little details or whatever you need to do. Now, let's say I was doing some texture and I wanted some texture in here. So I can come over top, be super messy about this, just get little like squiggles or whatever in, or even like, you know, a little spot here. And I don't have to blend this out completely. So I can come again with my water brush and I can just hit some of these areas and blend some out and leave some there. And it's just going to give us like this little textured look in the background. And same here, you can just come over top and just lightly blend some of it out. So I mean, you can kind of use these different techniques depending on what you're doing. I like to use this if I'm doing like cakes or cookies, and again, if I'm doing like animals and stuff, I'll do this technique. So it just depends what you're doing, what technique you're going to use. Now, if you need to come over top with highlights, you can use this scrubbing technique, or you can come over top with something like the P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, or even just gouache. But if I'm using watercolor pencils, I tend to use my Inktense white block. Now, this is super opaque, but when you first put it on, it's pretty translucent. So you're going to think, oh, that hardly did anything, but just wait. Once it starts drying, it's going to get even more opaque. So I usually just take my water brush or whatever brush I'm using, and I will get it on like this. And then I just come over top. So we'll do a little bit here besides this scrubber brush, so you can kind of start to see the difference. And then maybe I'll come over where I made some texture, and if I want to get in some little highlights or something, maybe I'll do some little dots here. And I kind of just keep playing around with this, and then if I need just a little bit of water, I'll do that on here. And the more water and the more stuff that you pick up, the more opaque it will be. So you can see we can have a much more opaque line, or just like a little bit. You can really have some fun with this. But if you were using this bleed proof white, again, you would kind of do the same thing. So I would just pick it up with the end of the brush and then just put it on. And you can see how much more opaque this is compared to the other Inktense block. But I find this also leaves a little bit different of a finish on top. So when you kind of like tilt the paper, it gives a little bit different look. Whereas the Inktense block, I find blends in a little bit better with the watercolor pencils, and I can also build it up. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and remove this masking fluid just to show you guys that you can get the exact same effect that you would with a watercolor. So, I mean, it still comes off nice and smooth. So that's just quickly some of the techniques that I like to use with my watercolor pencils. I'm sure there are tons more out there, but this is usually what I gravitate towards. So in the next video in this series, we're going to go ahead and use these techniques to do an artwork. So make sure you hit the notification bell and subscribe so you're notified of when that video goes out. And I hope you guys enjoyed this series, and let me know down in the comments below what the next medium should be for our beginner series. And thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.